They're very pointed questions, but we can just start with Chief Justice Roberts. Why not? He's the Chief Justice. As he mentioned, generally, the Congress has the power to tax, and that's a power that's reserved only for them. Trump's lawyers, or the administration lawyers, are saying that this isn't a tax. What they're doing is essentially regulating imports. This is more about foreign policy, and what they're doing is trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. So they're regulating import to allow that to happen, and that any taxes that comes from that is incidental.
Okay, this is huge, like genuinely massive. The Supreme Court just made a move that has the White House in complete panic mode. We're talking about a case that could fundamentally reshape presidential power, and Trump's entire governing strategy just got thrown into chaos. On November 5th, the Supreme Court heard arguments about Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs. And based on how the justices were questioning Trump's lawyers, it's not looking good for the administration, not good at all. Conservative justices, the ones Trump was counting on to back him up, started grilling his legal team about whether the president actually has the authority to unilaterally impose sweeping international tariffs using emergency declarations. And the answers Trump's lawyers were giving apparently weren't convincing anyone. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's why this matters so much. Trump's entire economic agenda is built on tariffs. He's used emergency powers to impose tariffs on China, Europe, and other trading partners without going through Congress. He's claimed that national security emergencies give him the authority to bypass normal legislative processes, and for a while it looked like he was going to get away with it. But now the Supreme Court is signaling that they might strike down that authority. They might rule that Trump overstepped. They might say that presidents can't just declare emergencies whenever they want to implement policies that Congress won't approve. And if they do that, if they issue a broad ruling limiting emergency powers, Trump's governing strategy collapses. Not just on tariffs, on everything. Military deployments, sanctions, executive orders, all of it gets called into question. The oral arguments were apparently brutal for Trump's team. Legal analysts watching the hearing described the justices as deeply skeptical of the administration's arguments. Justice Sotomayor asked a particularly devastating question. She pointed to a recent case involving Biden and said, "Didn't we state in that case that an emergency can't clarify what is ambiguous?" That question goes to the heart of Trump's legal argument.
President Trump is issuing an ominous warning ahead of a ruling that will determine whether he overstepped his authority in imposing tariffs. Let's discuss all of this and more with Lydia DePillis. She covers the economy for the New York Times.
This is a major escalation of tariffs. It's across the board, across the entire world on most goods, although there are large exceptions which make those tariffs look a little bit bigger than they actually are in practice. But it is a reordering of global trade if they do stay in place. Now, you noted that there is a major court case underway that has to do with the legality of this type of tariff that President Trump has imposed on most countries.
The administration has been claiming that emergency declarations give the president broad authority to act. But Sotomayor is basically saying, we already decided that emergencies don't give you unlimited power. You can't use emergency declarations to do things the law doesn't clearly authorize. And if that becomes the court's ruling, Trump is in serious trouble because most of his major policy initiatives have relied on exactly that kind of emergency power expansion. The reaction inside the White House has been described as panic. Within hours of the oral arguments ending, there were emergency meetings happening throughout the West Wing. Senior advisors trying to figure out what this ruling might mean. Cabinet members reportedly discussing whether they should resign before the decision comes down. Legal teams scrambling to prepare for the possibility that major parts of Trump's agenda get struck down all at once. This isn't normal. Supreme Court cases don't usually trigger this kind of crisis atmosphere, but this case is different because the stakes are so incredibly high. If the court rules broadly against Trump's use of emergency powers, it doesn't just affect tariffs. It potentially invalidates dozens of major policy decisions Trump has made over the past 2 years. And here's what makes this even more devastating for Trump. The conservative justices were the ones asking the tough questions. Trump appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. He's been counting on having a friendly court that would back him up on these kinds of disputes. But conservative justices like Roberts and Kavanaugh were apparently just as skeptical as the liberal justices during oral arguments. That suggests this might not be a partisan split. This might be the court coming together across ideological lines to put limits on presidential power regardless of who's in office. And if that's true, Trump can't rely on his appointees to save him. He's got to actually win on the legal merits. And based on how the oral arguments went, that's not going to happen. Legal experts following the case are calling it a defining test for presidential power. They're saying this could be one of the most significant Supreme Court decisions in decades because it will determine how much authority presidents have to act unilaterally during claimed emergencies. And the implications go way beyond Trump. Whatever precedent gets set here will affect every future president. Democrats and Republicans. If the court rules that emergency powers are more limited than Trump claims, future presidents won't be able to use the same tactics Trump has used. That might be good for constitutional balance and separation of powers. But it's terrible news for Trump right now because he's built his entire presidency around maximizing executive authority and bypassing Congress whenever possible. The tension inside the administration is reportedly at an all-time high. Cabinet members are worried about being associated with policies that might get struck down as unconstitutional. Lawyers are worried about their professional reputations if they've been advising Trump to take actions that the Supreme Court says are illegal. And Trump himself is apparently furious that his own court appointees aren't backing him up the way he expected. This is shaping up to be one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions of Trump's presidency, and it's coming at the worst possible time as he's trying to govern and prepare for midterm elections. Let's break down exactly what's at stake here. All right, let's dive into the details because this case is way more complicated than just whether Trump can impose tariffs. This is fundamentally about the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. It's about whether presidents can use emergency declarations to do things Congress won't authorize. And it's about whether the Supreme Court is willing to put meaningful limits on presidential power, or whether they'll continue letting the executive branch expand its authority unchecked. First, let's talk about the specific legal issue at stake. Trump has been using something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs. This is a law from 1977 that gives the president authority to regulate international commerce during national emergencies. The law is intentionally vague about what constitutes an emergency and what actions the president can take. Trump has interpreted that vagueness as giving him almost unlimited authority. He's declared economic emergencies related to trade imbalances, national security concerns, and various other justifications. And he's used those emergency declarations to impose tariffs that Congress probably wouldn't approve if they had to vote on them. The plaintiffs challenging Trump's tariffs argue that he's abusing the emergency powers law. They say Congress never intended to give presidents the authority to unilaterally reshape American trade policy without any legislative input. They point out that the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce. And they argue that letting Trump use emergency declarations to bypass Congress violates the separation of powers. Trump's lawyers counter that the law gives the president broad discretion to determine what constitutes an emergency and what actions are necessary to address it. They say courts shouldn't second-guess presidential decisions about national security and economic policy, and they argue that limiting Trump's authority would hamstring future presidents trying to respond to real emergencies. Both sides make compelling arguments, but based on the oral arguments, it seems like the justices are leaning toward the plaintiff's interpretation. The specific questions the justices asked during oral arguments are really revealing. Justice Sotomayor's question about whether emergencies can clarify ambiguity suggests she thinks Trump is stretching the law beyond what it was meant to allow. Chief Justice Roberts reportedly asked Trump's lawyers whether there are any limits on presidential emergency powers, whether the president could declare any situation an emergency and take any action. That's the kind of question that suggests Roberts is worried about creating a precedent that gives presidents too much unchecked power. Justice Kavanaugh asked about Congress's role and whether the legislative branch has been effectively cut out of trade policy decisions. Again, that suggests concern about separation of powers and whether Trump has gone too far in bypassing Congress. These aren't softballs. These are tough questions that get to the fundamental constitutional issues at stake. What makes this particularly interesting is that the conservative justices seem just as concerned as the liberal justices. Normally, you'd expect a partisan split on a case involving Trump's authority. Conservative justices backing Trump, liberal justices opposing him. But that's not what happened during oral arguments. The conservative justices were asking hard questions too. They were pushing back on Trump's lawyers' arguments. They were expressing skepticism about unlimited presidential power. That suggests this might be a case where the court's decision isn't driven by politics, but by genuine constitutional concerns. And if that's true, Trump is in trouble because the legal arguments against his position are pretty strong. The law wasn't designed to give presidents the kind of sweeping authority Trump has been claiming. And the court knows that letting Trump get away with this interpretation sets a dangerous precedent for future presidents. The potential scope of the ruling is what has the White House in panic mode. If the court rules narrowly, they might just strike down Trump's specific tariffs without affecting his other uses of emergency powers. That would be bad but manageable. Trump could try different legal justifications for the tariffs or work with Congress to get legislative approval. But if the court rules broadly, if they say that emergency powers can't be used the way Trump has been using them, then it affects everything. Military deployments that Trump authorized under emergency declarations could be challenged. Sanctions he imposed could be questioned. Executive orders based on emergency authority could be invalidated. Suddenly, Trump's entire governing strategy falls apart because he's been relying heavily on emergency powers to bypass Congress and implement policies unilaterally. A broad Supreme Court ruling could force Trump to actually work with Congress on major policy decisions. And given how divided Congress is, that means many of Trump's priorities simply won't happen. The internal White House reaction reflects how serious this is. Reports describe emergency meetings throughout the administration as officials try to game out different scenarios. What happens if the court strikes down just the tariffs? What if they issue a broader ruling? How do they prepare for either possibility? There are reportedly discussions about whether to start working with Congress proactively on legislation to authorize tariffs before the court rules. But that opens up its own problems because Congress might not give Trump everything he wants. Some cabinet members are apparently so worried about the ruling that they're considering resigning before it comes down. They don't want to be associated with policies that get declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. That's how toxic this situation has become. Even loyal Trump appointees are thinking about jumping ship. The political implications are enormous. Trump has built his political brand around being a strong executive who gets things done without being bogged down by Congress. He's presented himself as someone who takes decisive action while Congress debates endlessly. But if the Supreme Court says Trump has been overstepping his authority all along, that narrative collapses. Trump looks weak instead of strong. He looks like someone who tried to violate the Constitution instead of someone who was effectively governing. And heading into midterm elections, that's a political disaster. Democrats will use the ruling to attack Trump as a would-be authoritarian who had to be reined in by the courts. Republicans will be in the awkward position of either defending Trump's overreach or admitting the Supreme Court was right to limit his power. Neither option is good politically. Let's also talk about the international implications because tariffs aren't just a domestic issue. Trump's tariffs have disrupted trade relationships with allies and adversaries. Other countries have retaliated with their own tariffs. Supply chains have been disrupted. Businesses have had to adjust to unpredictable trade policies. If the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's tariffs, what happens to all those trade relationships? Do the tariffs immediately disappear? Does Trump have to negotiate new arrangements with other countries? Do businesses that adjusted to the tariffs suddenly have to readjust? The economic chaos could be significant, and that economic chaos has political consequences because voters care about economic stability. If Trump's tariff policy gets struck down and creates market uncertainty and business disruption, voters are going to blame Trump for the mess. The conservative legal movement is in a really awkward position here, too. For years, conservatives have argued for limiting executive power and restoring congressional authority. They've criticized Democratic presidents for overusing executive actions. They've championed separation of powers and constitutional limits. But now their guy, Trump, is the one claiming sweeping executive authority and bypassing Congress. Do conservatives stick with their principles and support limiting Trump's power? Or do they abandon those principles to back Trump? Different conservative legal scholars are going different directions on this. Some are arguing that the court should limit Trump's emergency powers because that's consistent with conservative constitutional principles. Others are arguing that Trump needs broad authority to effectively govern, and the court shouldn't interfere. The internal division within the conservative legal movement reflects how complicated this case is politically and legally. Okay, let's break down what actually matters going forward, because this case has real-world consequences that are going to affect millions of people. First, when will we get a decision and what will it say? The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on November 5th. Based on normal timelines, we're probably looking at a decision sometime in early 2026. The justices will deliberate, draft opinions, circulate them among themselves, and eventually release a ruling. What that ruling says is the trillion-dollar question. If they rule narrowly, they might just strike down Trump's specific tariffs on technical grounds without addressing the broader constitutional issues. That would be a limited loss for Trump, embarrassing but not catastrophic. But if they rule broadly and say that presidents can't use emergency powers the way Trump has been using them, that's a game changer that affects everything Trump does. Second, what happens to existing tariffs if the court rules against Trump? This is complicated. If the court says Trump's tariffs are illegal, they probably don't just automatically disappear. There would need to be some kind of unwinding process. Trump might have 60 or 90 days to either get congressional approval for the tariffs or phase them out. That creates a period of economic uncertainty as businesses don't know what trade policy will look like going forward, and it puts enormous pressure on Congress to act. Do they authorize Trump's tariffs retroactively to avoid economic disruption? Or do they let them expire and deal with the economic fallout? Neither option is politically easy, which is why everyone in Washington is dreading this decision. Third, how does this affect Trump's other uses of emergency powers? This is where things get really complicated. Trump has declared multiple national emergencies during his presidency. He's used emergency powers to redirect military funding, impose sanctions, deploy troops, and implement various other policies. If the Supreme Court issues a broad ruling saying emergency powers are more limited than Trump claims, all of those actions become potentially vulnerable to legal challenge. We could see a wave of lawsuits challenging everything Trump has done under emergency authority. And even if those lawsuits don't all succeed, defending against them takes time and resources and creates political problems. Trump would have to constantly justify his actions and defend his use of emergency powers instead of focusing on implementing his agenda. Fourth, what does this mean politically heading into the midterms? This is bad timing for Trump. Midterm elections are less than a year away. Republicans need to run on a record of accomplishments and effective governance. But if the Supreme Court strikes down major parts of Trump's economic policy, that becomes really difficult. Democrats will argue that Trump has been governing unconstitutionally and needed to be reined in by the courts. They'll point to the Supreme Court decision as proof that Trump can't be trusted with power. Republicans will try to spin it as judicial overreach or argue that Trump was trying to protect American workers. But defending a Supreme Court loss is never easy politically, and this could depress Republican turnout or energize Democratic voters who see it as vindication that Trump has been overstepping his authority. Now let's talk about the constitutional principles at stake, because they're important beyond just this specific case. The Constitution establishes separation of powers, Congress makes laws, the president executes them, and courts interpret them. That system only works if each branch stays in its lane and respects the other's authority. For decades, the balance has been shifting toward more executive power and less congressional authority. Presidents of both parties have been expanding their ability to act unilaterally through executive orders, emergency declarations, and creative interpretations of existing laws. Congress has largely allowed this to happen because it's easier to let the president take politically risky actions than to vote on them. But the result is that presidents now have far more power than the founders probably intended. This Supreme Court case is potentially a correction. The court saying we've let executive power expand too far and it's time to restore some balance. Whether you think that's good depends partly on your political preferences and partly on your constitutional philosophy. If you like Trump's policies, you probably want the court to give him maximum flexibility to implement them. If you don't like Trump's policies, you probably want the court to limit his power. But the smarter way to think about it is, what kind of precedent do you want set for all future presidents? Because whatever the court decides in this case will apply to the next president and the one after that. If you give Trump unlimited emergency powers, you're also giving those powers to every future president, and you might not like how the next president uses them. That's why some conservatives are actually supporting limits on Trump's authority in this case. They're thinking long-term about constitutional structure rather than short-term political wins. The panic inside the White House reflects that they understand how high the stakes are. This isn't just another court case they can spin or ignore. This is the Supreme Court potentially invalidating core elements of Trump's governing strategy. Senior advisors are scrambling to prepare contingency plans. What policies can they salvage if the tariffs get struck down? How do they work with Congress to get legislative authorization for things they've been doing unilaterally? How do they minimize the political damage from a Supreme Court loss? These are the conversations happening right now in the West Wing. And they're not easy conversations because there aren't good answers. You can't undo 2 years of governing based on emergency powers overnight. The disruption would be massive. Here's what you should be watching for over the next few months. First, whether the administration starts working with Congress proactively to authorize tariffs or other policies before the court rules. That would signal they expect to lose and are trying to get ahead of it. Second, whether any cabinet members or senior advisors resign. If people start jumping ship, it suggests they think the situation is unwinnable and they want to distance themselves before the court rules. Third, how businesses and financial markets react to the uncertainty. If markets start pricing in the possibility that tariffs will be struck down, that creates economic pressure on Trump to settle or compromise. Fourth, what the court actually says when they issue their decision. The specific language they use will determine how broad the ruling is and what it means for future cases. The long-term implications of this case can't be overstated. This could be one of those landmark Supreme Court decisions that gets taught in constitutional law classes for generations. It could fundamentally reshape the balance of power between Congress and the president. It could force a rethinking of how emergency powers work and what limits exist on presidential authority. And it's all happening because Trump pushed the boundaries of executive power further than any recent president. He tested the system, and now the system is pushing back. Whether you think that's good or bad probably depends on your politics. But everyone should care about getting the constitutional structure right because that affects all of us regardless of party. So what's the bottom line here? The Supreme Court heard arguments in a case about Trump's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs. Based on the oral arguments, the justices seemed skeptical of Trump's claims to sweeping authority. The administration is in panic mode because a ruling against them could invalidate major parts of their agenda. We're probably months away from a decision, but the uncertainty alone is creating problems for Trump politically and economically. Watch for signs of how the administration is preparing for a potential loss, whether they start working with Congress, whether people resign, whether they try to settle the case to avoid a broad ruling, because this story is far from over and the stakes couldn't be higher. A broad Supreme Court ruling limiting presidential emergency powers would be one of the most significant constitutional decisions in decades. Stay tuned.